Welcome to this week's episode of the Deliberate Leader podcast. This week I'm joined by a very special guest, Maureen Kyne. Maureen is an Australian-based investigator, workplace behaviour expert, specialist. She deals with pretty grim areas actually, like conflict, sexual harassment, bullying complaints. The reason I wanted to get Maureen on to the conversation today and into our podcast is that she's able to really bring some of those deliberate leader attributes that she's seen that help leaders to navigate those really difficult situations. Maureen has a breadth of experience across health, manufacturing, blue-collar industries and white-collar industries, and she shares some of that today with us, and particularly some lessons that she learned early on in her career. It's a conversation you don't want to miss, so please enjoy this podcast with Maureen Kyne on The Deliberate Leader this week. Welcome to this week's episode of the Deliberate Leader podcast, and I'm joined by the wonderful Maureen Kyne. Maureen, welcome.
Thank you. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Me too. Just as before we hit record, I was reflecting on all the many years of experience that you have, and I can't wait for you to share some of those nuggets with our audience today. So thanks so much for jumping on in.
Absolutely looking forward to it. I hope that I don't reflect on too many sort of incidents that could sort of make my hair turn curly or curly.
Couldn't be curlier than mine, Maureen. Could not be curlier than mine. It's all good. All good for us. Maureen, I know that you've been doing a lot of work over the years on particularly workplace bullying and harassment, discrimination. And I was keen to have you on the podcast because I know you've got a new area of research with your book, Upward Bullying, coming out next year. And sometimes I think one of the hardest parts of leadership is dealing with those really tricky situations of which you would have seen hundreds, if not thousands, over the years. Maureen, in your experience, how do leaders best respond when they're put into those situations of, conflict and high risk situations, which often these types of, situations are? How do they best respond?
That's a really, really good question because they're so emotionally charged at that particular time. And there's a huge amount of self-doubt. And I often find that sometimes these situations have been going on for a really long period of time. And so they've been manifesting all of these scenarios in their head. And so they're just so busy in their head that there's no clarity about the situation. So when I'm working with these guys, I often just say, I want you just to stop for a moment. And I actually want you to step back away from this because you're so emotionally invested in it. You're not actually able to look through the lens from a professional perspective. You're not able to look through that lens in your role and how you got here. So it's time, as I said, it's just time to stop. And, as I said, then start. And then one of the things we then start to do is we then start to reflect on the situation and how did it escalate and what, who were the contributors, to that particular situation. And then we start to unravel it. It's like getting, like even a ball of string or, that's all been intertwined by a kitten. And all of a sudden you're trying to unravel all of those bits and pieces to think, how can I now start to get back and look at that, rolled skein of wool rather than this big mangled mess. And that's what it often looks like for them.
Maureen, in your experience, as you described that kind of messy ball of string, and I'm sure we've all been there at different times in our career, why do you think that particularly as leaders, we let it get that far before we have to address it? Because by that stage, it's that tangled that we have to. What, in your experience, what leads people to kind of leave it for that long before they do something about it?
There's a couple of scenarios around this. One is it can be the culture of the organisation. So if there is say the culture is quite toxic, it could be poor leadership, because quite often what I see is that I get phone calls from people saying, this is actually what's going on, and it's down at the grassroots level, at that supervisor, team leader role. And I have people who ring me and say, I want to support this person. So my big question is, what's happening at the top? Where's the leadership at? Are they prepared to address this type of behaviour? And often I get a question of, no, they're not. They're not invested. So, we've got that particular situation that happens, but we've also got people who, we're people pleasers. I'm a people pleaser. And, I often have got myself into a huge mess quite a few times because I've been a people pleaser. And with age and with having the right mentors around you, you can then start to think, as a leader from a people pleaser, I'm tending to brush over these situations. It'll be okay. It'll be okay. That's just the way that they are. So they allow then that behaviour then to just rumble along. And it's like that snowball. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it gets to the stage then where they feel, I know I haven't addressed all of these other underlying situations. And now all of a sudden we've got this massive, big situation that looks like, it's going to be a volcano at the end of the day. And then they're stuck. They've got no idea. They don't know where to run as to how to handle that situation. And then there's also people who are new to the role, either new into the organisation or been made a team leader or supervisor, and they were a mate previously. So we've got three various situations where people can allow situations to escalate because, again, being a people pleaser, not having the support that they need, and also as they're just particularly new to the role.
Yeah, and that's a common one where people are promoted in from their team. So they were effectively working with a group of peers and colleagues, and then they're being promoted up. And we hear, that time and time again, that can be quite tricky in terms of then leading it and addressing some of these, more difficult circumstances.
And it's going from that being a mate to a manager.
Yeah.
And I think one of the areas I see that where a lot of vulnerability comes in is particularly in regional areas where you're not only a mate at work, but your friends outside work, your kids go to school together, your kids play sport together, or you might play sport together. So we've got all of these other factors that could contributing, from that mate now becoming a manager and that mate now having to say, as the manager, your behaviour is inappropriate. We need to address it.
Yeah.
And calling out behaviour. And they don't because they fear losing that friendship.
And as humans, we all want to belong, right? So that's one of our biggest driving needs, if not the biggest now, the new research is pointing to. It's our feeling of, wanting to belong and that social connectedness.
Mm.
So when, it's not hard then to see why so many people avoid these conversations, because it puts at risk all of those different relationships, as you say, when your friends, particularly within your community, and your relationship then is multi-layered. So you've got a, employee manager relationship, but then you've also got this, friendship. Yeah.
And even in regional areas, it's your relatives.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
And so,
Yes.
you go into a workplace here in any regional area, and the amount of, they might sort of, relationships that have established, within the workplace is extraordinary. Cousins, brothers, sisters, parents,
Yes.
children, all working in the same workplace.
Yeah. So Maureen, for those that don't know, obviously you're working mainly living out in regional Victoria. And do you see that as quite, so regional Victoria here in Australia, of course, we've got some international people too. In your experience, do you find that it is different to how these kinds of issues of difficult situations are managed in more your metro cities? Is it different?
There is a difference, and I think that if we're in the metro area, unless you're sort of in a tight-knit community in some of the smaller metro areas, you can sort of get that internal-external relationship happening. But in most cases, people go home from work and they never see that person ever again, because they're coming from all various directions. So, yeah, I do see it as a key issue in the regional areas. And regional businesses are family operated. So we again have that other complexity happening within that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't watched the infamous show Succession, which everyone talks about, around the family politics. But imagine that, like you have your Christmas break and you can't even get away from them because you're there. You're there on Christmas Day, Boxing Day, celebrating with the family during the holidays. That would be nightmarish, I imagine, for some.
And it is. But I think the interesting thing is that it's really important to look at that succession plan and how that's structured. And I've worked with, as I said, a lot of regional businesses, family operated businesses. And one of the things that we see, people who are savvy and smart about it and want that business to survive for the second, third, fourth, fifth generation, in actual fact, bring in an external general manager, an external MD, so that then they start to bring new undertakings, new learnings, but they end up being the mediator if they're really good and helping them manage those dynamics. And I've seen sometimes where, you might have 3 siblings coming up and 1 or 2 of them, when you drive right down deep, in actual fact, need to leave the business altogether because it's not what they've been dragged along and it's been an expectation that they want to remain in the business. But in actual fact, they don't.
Yeah.
And so therefore, when those tough conversations are had and they do leave, then the business is really solid then going forward and keeping that sustainability and longevity happening.
It's definitely, it definitely is about having that deliberate approach to business, and when that is about bringing an external person in that can best lead the organisation, certainly, as you've spoken about in this conversation already, but around having a very deliberate strategy around even the relationships and the boundaries of those relationships. So it does enable us to have those difficult conversations where we need to. Maureen, no doubt with all of the leaders that you've worked across your career and that you continue to work with, you would have seen some essential characteristics and traits, in terms of a deliberate leader. What would you say are your kind of top traits and top characteristics that you've observed? And how do these then contribute to this overall organisational success?
There are a couple of key ones. And I think we talk about communication. And I think communication is absolutely essential. And I don't mean just, sort of verbally speaking, but communication also involves listening. And I think listening with intent. And I think that's one of the really key things, because when we stop and we listen to people talking, we put the pens down, we move away from the computer, whatever it might be. But when we listen with intent, we actually hear a lot of gold nuggets coming out. They might not align with where we want to be at the moment, but in actual fact, I think when we do listen, it provides a huge amount of opportunity, but also lets that other person feel like they're being heard, feel like that they're contributing, to the organisation. I think that's a really key one. So communication is absolutely essential. I think the other one is actually having your own self-awareness. For me, I was a real hothead. My father used to sort of say, instead of pouring that tame on your hair, why don't you drink it? But the interesting thing was, as you grow and as you become more mature, you then start to think that behaviour is not acceptable, and it won't be acceptable in the workplace. It won't be acceptable in our relationships. So we then I think that's really important to look at our own self-awareness. Again, if we are a people pleaser, if we are really direct, are we coming across and hurting somebody's emotions in the way that we're giving instruction? Are we giving instruction or are we giving an order? And I think these are the types of things. So when we have a higher self-awareness about our own behaviour, it also then, I think it's also important to look at the self-awareness that people have around us. Where are they sat? Where are they at? And that then also can help with the conversation having with them about how they're contributing either to a toxic relationship or a really great culture within the organisation. So self-awareness is absolutely essential. I think the other one is around positive duty, but I think it's around, I like to liken it more with attitude. And I think that if we have the right attitude about how we're approaching things, and, things aren't always easy. There's always spanners being thrown in the works around, change, adaptability. And some of the clients I work with, things just can flip, on a dime. When a client rings and says, hey, look, I've got an issue with the feed for this particular cow. We need to change that right now. But, the truck's already ready to go with the feed. So we have all of these different types of change. So as a leader in an organisation, we need to be able to look at that and how can we meet the demands of our staff, our clients, and the like to get a really good outcome. So attitude is extremely, important. The other one I think is about having purpose. What is your purpose? Because purpose, when I look at purpose, it actually drives your vision. And, I run programs on developing leaders, and one of them is really focused on what is the vision. We often have a vision for the organisation, but what's the vision for your team? Because it can be slightly different, because even it will match it will blend with the vision of the organisation. But what's the vision you have for your team? What's your vision and purpose in what you're doing? Why are you in that organisation? And often we hear people say, I hate being here. Well, why? And they'll also say, oh, but it's so-and-so over at another company. I said to them, the grass is always greener, but, you think the grass is greener, but it's not. Yeah. Why don't you sort of reinvest in the energy here where you really do like the company and think about what is the purpose, what's your purpose here, and how can you align that to the vision of your team and the organisation.
And that gives people, I guess, some control back, particularly purpose, that positive duty or attitude that you mentioned, self-awareness, and then communication. I was talking to someone earlier today and we were talking about controlling the controllables. So often in a situation, it's where things are feeling very ambiguous and unclear. These 4 things that you've mentioned here around those characteristics, they are very controllable. They are within your control because you are the one that can set these things, set the direction, but also the tone. You mentioned positive duty, which I love. I've not heard it framed in that way before. And then you talked about that as being attitude. And around that, it's about also adaptability. So as things change and, maybe adverse circumstances occur, what is going to be your positive duty around that? What's the attitude that you bring? Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, Maureen, when leaders are often asked to balance, this need to be adaptable around changing circumstances, but also staying true to their deliberate leadership principles. In your mind, what works best for leaders when they're trying to navigate that? I get a lot of leaders that say, gee, I feel sometimes like I'm being inconsistent, that I'm flip-flopping with my decision because I've got to be adaptable, but I've also got to stay true to my deliberate leader principles. What's your view on that? How can leaders do that best?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I think the thing is that sometimes it's tough having to stick by decisions that have been made above you. And I think sometimes I see leaders who slow down the pace, they become indecisive when they are unsure about implementing. They're unsure about how the team are going to respond to the particular change that's now being put forward. So I think it's really important for them to start thinking strategically more about what the goal is at the end of the day, and sort of map that out and think from a strategic perspective, how are they then going to communicate that back to their team in the meeting, and so saying, okay, this is a strategic process that the organisation wants to put into place. Let's plan out how we're going to do that and involve the team in that decision making so that you're empowering the team. and you're allowing them to be part of the developing the new the response there. So you've got people taking ownership, because I think sometimes it's almost like they're feeling the weight of they're feeling that weight on their shoulders, and therefore they're being weighed down by this particular new change or situation, and they're not fully on board yet because they can't clearly see what the vision might look like at the end of the day. So it's
Sorry, go on.
No, so it's really about sort of, I think, bringing their team in when we have these difficult times, because I think when we start to look at, we've hired all this variety of different people because of their skill set, and strategically they're all able to come up with the right solution, to implement that new change or that new strategy. So it doesn't always have to sit on your shoulders.
I think when the team, and I love what you're saying there, because what I'm hearing as you say that is that the team then have a greater level of insight into the thinking and the consideration, the deliberation that goes into making a decision. And then if they know that, then they'll be more aware of the circumstances that might lead to the leader needing to change their mind or adapting.
Adapting, absolutely.
I love that. There's certainly that sense of bringing them in. I love what you shared there about empowering them, which also shares the responsibility of whatever it is that the team decides. So I imagine that, and I know that it eases the burden on the leader, the one who's got the assumed title of the leader, because they are able to connect in with their team in a more powerful way around shared decision making.
I think sometimes we look at that leader versus manager. I think sometimes is that they're needing to make that management decision. It's like a black and white.
Mm.
And I think that's sort of, sometimes where we need to be going as well, is that they don't know all of the answers, and they're not expected to know all of the answers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think particularly if somebody's new to the role or new to the organisation, that's where we can sort of hit that wall, and they're trying to take on the whole of the workload or the whole of the change that's happening.
Yeah, and that's hard when you're in a new organisation, a new industry. You're learning the way. For a lot of leaders, they don't want to be perceived as not knowing what to do and not knowing how to handle a particular situation. I reckon that pride sometimes can get in the way of enabling us to really learn as we're in organisations. Adopting that learner as or leader as learner rather.
And I think there's a huge amount of expectations, particularly a new leader in an organisation. So somebody who's new come to the organisation, they put a huge amount of expectations on themselves, which is over and above what the organisation is perhaps expecting of them to undertake, but also somebody who's been promoted within the organisation. There's a huge expectation that they're putting on themselves. I don't want them to think I'm not capable, when in actual fact, we all need a mentor. We all need coaching. And I think that's a really important part to think about, even when we are appointing leaders, into their role, coming in external or new, is that I think that there should be a process set up that there is an expectation that you will have coaching time, you will have mentor time from different leaders, within the organisation. So that then helps build up their skill set to be better equipped, to do their job as well.
Yeah. And that's there again, that learning points to, or that coaching rather points to that ongoing nature of learning as that, rather than going in and knowing or thinking that you know it all. That's often become unstuck where we think we know it all. There's no room to move then and to learn anything new. Maureen, in your experience working with different leaders in different organisations, have you come across some common challenges or misconceptions that you've encountered regarding deliberate leadership? And what do you reckon is the best way for leaders to overcome some of those misconceptions or common challenges?
Just sort of thinking common challenges. Again, I think if we go back to, there's always this expectation. So we're putting that expectation on ourselves that we are expected that we should be able to deliver in that particular situation. I think sometimes also then we can overlook our own self-awareness, being aware of what's actually going on in the organisation.
Just on that point, maybe, Maureen, if we could expand a little bit on self-awareness. I know you mentioned it earlier on too around some of those essential qualities. And I think it's probably one of the number one things that can come up as a challenge. When a leader lacks that self-awareness, what are the common telltale signs of a leader that's lacking that self-awareness?
Well, they could be slow to make decisions.
Yeah.
And I think when we are slow to make decisions, then what we're doing is that we are in actual fact sending the wrong message to our team, that we are inadequate, and therefore that then will create a huge amount of unrest in the within that team in itself. It may even create unrest within their own peer leadership area as well. So potentially they're putting themselves at risk. One of the risks could be that their subordinates could start to bully them because they start to make the decisions around what needs to happen. And you can have one or two people in particular who are driving that. So therefore it makes the leadership role very precarious for them. The other one is that we often can see, I think if we start thinking about the challenges of not being a fear of speaking up, I think is one of the key challenges that will happen is that they're not going to speak up and speak to either, the HR, their immediate manager or the executive team about what the situation is that's happening, and therefore put themselves again in that really precarious situation where they could sort of become unraveled really, really quickly. Just sort of thinking about and I think the other one too is that I often sort of see people who are afraid to share their vulnerability. So that can be a challenge as well. And when we don't share that vulnerability, we're also then closing down any opportunity that's actually sitting around us. And therefore, we can be seen as a weak leader, again, by not speaking up, showing that we don't know a particular task, because sometimes, particularly if it's a new leader in an organisation, it's not expected that they're going to know every aspect of every task that's being undertaken in the organisation, and also that for those that have been promoted up as well. So It is important to be able to show the vulnerability, the appropriate people that they can get that support from.
That's hard. I reckon that's one of the hardest things for leaders, and certainly the leaders that I work with, because they're going in, and we've talked about throughout this conversation, they're going into an organisation, they want to be seen as an effective operator from the get-go. I often say that as leaders, we don't have the benefit of being able to wear the L plate on our back like our learner drivers.
Yeah.
We just don't have that. We get into the role, and whether we've got very limited experience or extensive experience, we are expected to operate from day one. And I think that vulnerability is key, because for different people, and perhaps when you've been in the leadership role for a long time and you've got that self-awareness, which you pointed out so aptly, you've got a sense of knowing what you don't know and assembling a team around you that can balance that gap, if you like, or maybe that thing that's not that you don't have, but that you've got others around you that have that. But when we're afraid to share that and we pretend to be something that we're not, or we pretend to overplay something that's not a strength, I reckon that's the thing that gets a lot of leaders undone, because their experience is distrust. People know then that you're not genuine, and it also, I think, impacts the culture of learning and whether we are lifelong learners, and whether we're not going to get everything right, but we can learn. This kind of fudging our way through.
And I think we've often, and you would have read too, is that being able to express with your team that you don't know the answer, and that you're asking, this is your resource, within the room, and to come up with brainstorming some ideas. And that goes back to, and I think sometimes when we are in that vulnerable situation, we could become, I think sometimes, a little bit biased So it's really important to check in on ourselves. Again, that's part of that self-awareness. But it's also important to check in and make sure that we're giving the same space to each individual within our team to be able to express that idea about what, might be the potential solution for the particular situation. And because sometimes I see leaders shutting down one or two because either they might be a little bit more loud or they might be incredibly quiet. So then they need to sort of really be aware of the different personalities they've got within their team and give everybody the opportunity to put that idea forward in that vulnerable state that they're in, because they're anxious at the moment. So they're going to revert back to their normal profile, normal personality.
And that difference in working style that you're talking about there, it's harder to understand someone else's working style when it is different to ours. And that working style might extend to communication, as you talked about before, or the way that we're choosing to digest information, even the way we turn up in the team, whether we're, happy to be very transparent, very open, or whether we're a bit more, conservative, maybe considered and reflective even in our communication style. I think that's a really important point around not always giving people a go that are similar to us with a different kind of style.
Yeah.
Or same kind of style, rather.
Yeah. And look, it was interesting when I worked with James Hardy, and we'd have a big think tank days, and I was just told to sit on my hands until everybody had to go, because they said I was had one of the most conceptual minds.
Yeah.
So I had to be last and let everybody.
How did that feel, Maureen? Like being asked to effectively be last and not contribute too soon. How did that make you feel?
It was like in those early days. This is about me becoming self-aware of who I was and my personality.
Yeah.
And like in those early days, I sort of took it as an insult.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. So again, with coaching and mentoring and things like that, I started to realize that, hey, we do have all these different personality styles and how we are going to communicate. So I did sit back then and wait. And then somebody might say, oh, no, what's your thoughts? And then I'd be able to sort of talk. But yeah, it was, and I think that's a really important thing to, again, as I said, just take time and reflect. And as I said, for a leader, but as for a team member, but it's also become part of how does that team leader, again, communicate to their team as an individual about why they're requesting certain ways things are going to be done, so that it helps everyone within the team participate. It's an important part of communication, because otherwise, as I said, like in the early days, I was offended because of the way it was delivered.
You mentioned before we said communication is one of those key characteristics of a deliberate leader and listening with intent. Did that feedback help you to be a better active listener?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And is it something you still do today when you're communicating?
Absolutely. Like when we're in organised, it doesn't matter what environment we're in. I think, all right, it's time for you to be quiet. Just sit back and listen and let everybody else have their opportunity in their say. We see the context of where we're at. And also being an investigator, when I've been investigating workplace behaviour and in some really serious situations. It's really interesting, though, what I've heard by not speaking.
Tell us a little bit more.
And it's when I've sat back and I've put my pen down and I've really actively let my whole body take in the situation. It's amazing the clarity about what's actually playing out in front of you. And I often describe it like being at the MCG. And I hope most people know what the MCG is. But it's like
Albert Cricket Ground, for those that don't, one of our largest sports stadiums in Australia.
So it's like being at the MCG and being up on the very top of one of the stands, and then sitting there by yourself and looking down at what's actually happening down on the ground and watching the play taking place and strategically thinking who's doing what, where and how. And it really gives you a really great opportunity. And that was something somebody told me about how to do that probably in my mid-30s, when I was with James Hardy. And it's something I've kept in my mind all the time, is that's a way that I step back and just relax and then see the play and how it's all happening. And again, as I said, then it's amazing what you see and what you hear.
Yeah. I think that's an absolute piece of gold there, that you've got, the way I can describe it is you play a dual role, and that is you're in the conversation, but you're on top of the conversation. And I think that image certainly comes to mind. If people, go on to Google and get a vision of the MCG if you're not familiar with what it is, particularly for our people listening outside of Australia. But it is a massive, it's 100,000 plus person stadium. And when you're in what we call the nosebleed sections, like right up the top, there's not, you can see obviously the play, but you do get a different angle from when you are sitting at eye level and being able to see. As you said, you get an opportunity to observe where people are, and you can better see, I think, the sequence of what could be the next steps, because you've got that perspective, a different kind of perspective as to when you are at eye level.
Absolutely. And sometimes I also say to people, do you mind if I have my phone there? Do you mind if I record that? So that then I'm totally present. And then later on I can listen to the recording if I want to make additional notes and things like that. But I think it's a really important part to remove yourself from the play.
Yeah.
And step back.
And I think for certain people might get nervous about that. They might wonder about, well, will I miss something? Will I, maybe I'll forget my 9-year-old constant interrupter. And he says, if I don't say it now, I'm going to forget what I've got to say. And I think in that moment, it's about letting go of that being the most important thing, because there's a lovely organic feel to what you're talking about there in terms of how the conversation ought to unfold and take place. And that whatever we might have to, bring to that conversation is actually not the most important thing. And if we are meant to bring whatever it is, we'll have our time to do so.
And it's an interesting one when we're doing the investigations or when I'm in that environment. It's actually also creating silence, letting silence drop for a moment. And it gives actually everybody that time to settle into the emotion, the situation, the solution that's being put forward. And then another technique that I often use, and I just use and. So I let then the participants then contribute more. And so it's really helping you peel back those layers that you often sort of see built up over a period of time. And again, as I said, it's like that tangled mess of wool. All of a sudden it's actually sort of being untangled a lot more gentler than, if you were trying to get in there and make it happen in that hour. Because sometimes I think we allocate time and we're constrained by time, and we need to get that solution there and then in that time frame of 15 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour. But in actual fact, if we step back and took 2 hours, we may get a much better solution because we haven't been forcing a situation. And I think that is important as well.
It's that creating the silence, Maureen, is so powerful. And I know even in facilitation, it's a facilitator's, technique. It's one of our strategies, giving you a little view behind the curtain. But we'll often sit there with an awkward pause, and it feels very awkward, even for the facilitator at times. But they are deliberate pauses. As you say, the silence creates deeper understanding. It enables people to just take a breath and think about what is being discussed, what is being asked of me in this moment. What can I contribute? It's so, so powerful. But I'm always perplexed at the awkwardness that it creates, because we feel that we have to fill every single moment of silence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's like if we think about the way that we would have done presentations many, many years ago. It was slide after slide after slide after slide. Whereas now it's around creating a moment around a situation where people can, as I said, absorb, through discussion, because most people in the room already know the answer that you're actually trying to portray on the slide.
Allows them to catch up to and to be more brought into your thinking. Well, you mentioned a term before, which is around subordinates bullying. And I know that your new book is around upward bullying. Can you tell us a little bit more about, the research that's going into it, but also what you're uncovering as you're writing? Because it's not a term. I mean, often when we think about bullying, it's often direct manager to employee, or sometimes you'll get colleagues. But what is this term upward bullying, and what's your research telling you so far?
Around a couple of years ago, just before COVID, there was a fair amount I was speaking with clients who would talk to me about saying, they'd say, Maureen, I think my staff member's bullying me. That was like how it started. And then through COVID, I started getting a lot more phone calls in relation to this, that employees were refusing to return to the workplace. We had some essential services in particular, and employees were refusing to come into the workplace. So it was a really tense time for everybody, in particular with the amount of lockdowns that we had here in Victoria. But the intentional behaviour and response that was happening was really quite disturbing. And seeing some of the particular business owners, their own mental health really struggling now with the situation. And I was speaking with my media person at the time. We were posting a lot of media out there in relation to sexual harassment and bullying and the likes. And in conversation, I said to her, I think it's upward bullying. And so therefore, she's on the other end of the keyboard going, da-da-da-da. And next week she said, oh my God, there was some research done. It was published in 2010 by Sarah Branch at Griffith University. So I got all of her material and started reading it and having a look at it. And it was fabulous. But that was put out in 2010, and there were a lot of law firms and things like that, and some HR firms put out, this a condensed flyer as such, bit of information, and nothing had happened since. And then we started posting on LinkedIn about upward bullying and the intent and what it looked like. And all of a sudden I started getting messages from leaders all over the world around what was happening to them. So I've interviewed hundreds of people now in relation to what actually happened to them, how it happened, the impact that it was having on them, and started to really look at the intent that was actually behind this. We talk about bullying being managers, micromanaging their employees and setting out to make things difficult for a particular employee. But the intent that's behind upward bullying is quite different. And the person who orchestrates it is the conductor. So we can think about them starting out with a small band. So they get a couple of people on board, and all of a sudden they've got a massive orchestra. And so what they do is that they get people, within the team on board. So you'll get those that are coming willingly, and they will become the henchmen. And they will undermine everything that the leader is doing, and they'll be speaking for the person who's the conductor. Then you'll have those that have pulled in and fear of reprisal, and that's why they've come into this gang, this mob. And then what actually happens, the conductor will then go around and look for this leader's manager, and they get them on board. Unknowingly, the manager doesn't realise that they've been caught up in this web of deceit and lies around what the leader's capability is. They'll even go to the CEO. I've worked with CEOs who have been involved in a situation where the conductor has got the board involved. So it's a vicious and intentional process to undermine that leader. And sometimes you find that the conductor, they don't want that job, but they want the control. So they've got this informal, they've got power. It's informal power because it's not formal power, but they've got this informal power and it's hugely powerful and destructive. And I've had people who, when I've worked with some of the people in the organisations, in most cases we've navigated their way out of the organisation. And where I've seen organisations with HR involved, HR don't understand what this definition of upward bullying is. It's nowhere within policy, and they've got no idea on how to support the leader. And often they turn around and say, it's your problem. It's your employee. You should be managing them. And so it's just a really tenuous situation. And I've dealt with people in the ATO. I've dealt with people in magistrates' courts in Washington, with the National Health System in the UK, dealt with many, many high-profile leaders in all these organisations where HR, is supposed to be the support department for it. And in actual fact, when they've handled it, it's actually even sort of turned into quite a unpalatable situation. So I've been through, so now I've created the book, we're ready to go to the publisher, not the publisher, to the editor, and then hopefully be published in around April next year.
I think it's an area of research. I mean, it sounds like there's been some breakthroughs in that area of research, and then with a long pause, because 2010 through to, say, 2020, 2021, around that time, obviously a decade gone past. You can see it though. I mean, as you speak about it, it makes absolute sense because you see it all the time. And I think that's where culture in an organisation, I often speak about the leader who is in the role of leadership, but then the assumed leader. And as you've said there, they take on that role of conductor on behalf of others and really create a pretty dangerous, but also very comfortable situation for the leader in some cases, or whoever it is that they want to turn their attention to. Well, Maureen, we look forward to the book coming out because I think that that's going to be a great read, and certainly there's a lot in there about how leaders can be more deliberate and even deliberate around how they face into some of these situations. Because when you're a new leader, and again, no L plate on the back, and without maybe too much of that vulnerability and not enough of that resilience yet to be able to cope with it, you can see how that upward bullying can inadvertently, hopefully, occur, and hopefully not intentional, but I imagine that it'd be plenty of intentional kind of bullying going on too.
Absolutely. No.
Maureen, thank you. Thank you so much for being on our Deliberate Leader podcast today. There are so many things to share, and I know I've got pages of notes, and I'm sure others do too as they've been listening or maybe just tuning in on their walk. But thank you so much. Thank you for sharing. We look forward to the book coming out next year.
Awesome. Thank you. It's been a privilege to be talking to you today.
Likewise. Thanks, Maureen. You've just been listening to the Deliberate Leader podcast with Maureen Kyne this week. And some of those gold nuggets that Maureen left us with. She talked about, 4 key attributes that leaders really need to focus on in order to be more deliberate, and particularly dealing with tough circumstances that Maureen helps leaders with, such as harassment, bullying complaints, conflict, severe conflict in the workplace. She talked about communication, and specifically Maureen talked about that active listening. And she gave an awesome example of perspective and a real visual. So for those of you that are Victorians based here in Australia, you'll know what she meant when she says we're in the top of the stands at the MCG looking down. And she encourages us really to take that perspective view of a situation, which helps us to really actively listen and be able to then best map out what the next steps might be for that conversational situation that we might find ourselves in. Maureen also talked about self-awareness, and she shared a personal account of a moment in her career where she really needed to develop her self-awareness, and something that she continues 30 years on today. she talked about this positive duty, which I'd never come across as a term. And she went on to explain that this positive duty is about the right attitude. And then we went on to have a conversation about adaptability. And that if leaders are faced with an ambiguous circumstance, how can you bring that positive duty in and really bring about change and maybe even adaptability in your leadership, but through this positive duty? And then she left us with the last one, which is purpose. And she says, leaders often have a really strong vision of where they want to go in their strategy, but do the team share in this purpose? And they were Maureen's top kind of 4 tips for deliberate leader characteristics. Some things that Maureen has left us just to their watch outs, if you like, around deliberate leadership and things that can get in the way. But she talked about expectations and a mismanagement of expectations, either mismanagement on our part or on others, and really being very clear, having that clarity about what the expectations are, when things are going to be delivered and how they ought to be delivered. She then also went on to self-awareness, and that, if when we're lacking self-awareness as leaders, it looks like we're slow to make decisions, we might be feeling inadequate, it can create unrest in the team. And then she went on to talk about vulnerability and this fear of speaking up, which can also really catch us out. And then she encourages us to contribute last. And this was really off the back of Maureen's personal tip, I guess, on learning self-awareness, and something that again dates back for her about 30 years or so. So you'll have to tune into the episode to listen in and see what that was for Maureen. But, it was a great episode, and I think there's lots in there that we can continue to learn in terms of how we hone our ability to be more deliberate leaders, even when we find ourselves in circumstances that might be quite precarious and also full of risk for us and the organisation. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time on the Deliberate Leader podcast.